Hello and welcome back to a guide to recognizing your saints. Today is the 29th of April and it is a very special day indeed. Why? Because it's dedicated to Saint Catherine of Siena, a woman without whom I would not be here today. She really shaped my future in a way. And no, I don't mean spiritually, or do I? I don't know. But let's just say I discovered her back in grad school and fell in love immediately. Isn't that right? Absolutely. Catherine's my girl. I am coming to you from her hometown, direct from Siena, where Catherine is a very special figure because of the contributions that she made, not just to the city, but really to all of Europe. Catherine is also the patron saint of 2 of our 17 contrade, the Drago, which is where San Domenico is, and Oca, the goose, which is where her family home was. Because I have such an emotional connection to Catherine, it's hard to know where to start, and even if I can do justice to this rather amazing woman. But I'll try. Catherine did not live a long life. She died in 1380 at the age of 33. But she sure packed a lot in. Oh, please, won't you tell us about her life? Assolutamente. Of course I will. Thank you. Catherine was born in 1347, the 24th of 25 children, to the same mother. Just let that sink in for a moment. Her mother was called Mona Lapa and her father was Giacomo Benincasa. The Benincasa family was a family of dyers, tintori, and their family home was located above the fountain called Fonte Branda here in Siena. Fonte Branda is the oldest of our fountains, and water is fed to it by the underground aqueduct system known as the Bottini. Siena had no river, but dyers and tanners could work with the water supply there. At the tender age of 6, Catherine had her first significant vision. She was walking home with her brother Stefano, and she saw above the church of San Domenico Christ in pontifical robes. Now, what does this mean? Why would Christ be dressed as the Pope? It's very significant, and that will feature in Catherine's life later. Suffice it to say for now that the papacy was not in Rome in the 14th century, but rather in Avignon in the south of France. The popes had been there since 1309. Catherine knew early on that she wanted to dedicate her life to Christ and to doing good works within the city of Siena and beyond. Another of Catherine's visions was when the founders of the order came to her and basically said, "So which one of us are you going to choose?" Saint Dominic gave her a flaming lily, and so she chose his order. Here's San Domenico, and here's the Benincasa family home. She lived in the shadow of the basilica dedicated to Saint Dominic. Catherine, being a woman, could not become a friar, but she joined what is known as the tertiary or the third order of the Dominicans. Some incidents from Catherine's life involve, let's say, the typical Christian charity. For example, one day Catherine was in San Domenico and a beggar approached her and said, "Please, do you have anything for me? I'm so cold." And she had nothing but her own cloak, and so she gave it to him. Of course, later it turned out it was Christ in disguise. Same thing in San Domenico. A beggar approached her and said, "Do you have any money?" And Catherine had nothing, but she gave him the silver cross that she was wearing around her neck. Lo and behold, that too was Christ. One of my favorite things that happened to Catherine was the exchange of hearts. Christ appeared to Catherine one day and said, "I can feel your heart burning with love for me." And he, I like to say in a kind of Indiana Jones way, reached in and took her heart out of her chest and then disappeared. A few days later, he came back and said, "Hey, Catherine, how are you doing?" And she said, "I'm doing okay, but you took my heart." And he said, "Silly me, here, have mine." Catherine and Christ's bond was further strengthened with a mystical marriage. It was officiated by the Virgin Mary, and in attendance were such illustrious guests as John the Evangelist, King David, and of course, Saint Dominic. Normally, the mystical marriage shows Catherine marrying the adult Christ, which distinguishes her from Saint Catherine of Alexandria, who is normally depicted as marrying the infant Christ. However, there are always exceptions. So here's an image of Catherine marrying the adult Christ, and here's a slightly more problematic one of her marrying the infant Christ. I say problematic because, marrying a baby. Now, time out, you might say, but how are you getting all of this information? Well, Catherine had a confessor. His name was Raymond of Capua, the Blessed Raymond Raymond of Capua, and she had another one called Thomas Caffarini. And so they would hear her confession, and after Catherine died, in an effort to canonize her or to have her recognized as a saint by the Catholic Church, they wrote down her life. And you'll remember that word from previous lessons, hagiography, a holy biography. Raymond in particular told us about these events, these visions that Catherine had. Catherine worked in the hospital of Santa Maria della Scala here in Siena. One of the more icky acts of charity that Catherine performed involved a woman who had cancerous ulcers filled with pus all over her body. And Catherine, rather than just kind of clean it out, she sucked the pus from the ulcer. Just go with me here. After that rather difficult day on the job, Christ appeared to her again and said, "Catherine, that was really unnecessary, but thank you for showing such wonderful Christian charity. As a reward, you can drink from my side wound." Remember that at every Catholic Mass, there is the Eucharist, which is where you have the wafer and the wine, the body and the blood of Christ, respectively. She was able to drink from the life force that is directly from Christ. Instant Eucharist, shall we say. Also, the Virgin Mary once allowed her to drink directly from her breast. Blessed. But the most controversial vision was the reception of the Stigmata. Catherine was in Pisa in 1375, and she prayed in front of a crucifix, and she wanted to suffer as Christ had suffered. And the crucifix leaned forward, and out of the wounds from the hands, the side, and the feet came bloody rays. And Catherine was so thankful that she would be able to share in Christ's suffering. But then she said, "No, I don't want anybody to see these wounds." The bloody rays turned into rays of light, and Catherine received the Stigmata, yet they were invisible. She said that she felt the pain of those wounds every day of her life. But a little bit difficult to prove, wouldn't you say? The first stigmatic was Saint Francis of Assisi. He received them in 1224, he died in 1226, and he was canonized in 1228. He, of course, is the founder of the Franciscan order. The rival to the Franciscans was the Dominican order, and now the Dominicans have their very own stigmatic. When Catherine died, no proof. It was Raymond of Capua's hagiography, the Legenda Maior, that described this vision. But remember, Catherine died in 1380. She was not canonized until 1461, and it wasn't until the papacy of Urban VIII in the 17th century that her stigmata were recognized as true. Stigmata are the wounds that Christ received on the cross or any of the injuries that he sustained during the Passion. Catherine received the crown of thorns. Christ came to her yet again in a vision and said, "I've got a present for you. Would you like this crown of gold and jewels or the crown of thorns?" Obviously, Catherine chose the crown of thorns, and she said she had a headache every day from then on. Now you might ask, Anna, did she have the stigmata? And this is what I always say to people. I believe that she believed that she had them. I believe in her faith. What your faith is, it's not up to me to judge, but I believe that she believed what she believed in. So if Catherine is from Siena, she got the stigmata in Pisa. What was she doing traveling around? Catherine was a very interesting character for 14th century Italy in general, but as a religious woman, moving about, talking to very important people puts her really in a special place in history. Catherine was illiterate, but that's another story. Let's just say that she dictated almost 400 letters to leaders of Siena, powerful families, kings and queens, and even the Pope. The papacy was in Avignon, and Catherine was convinced that the papacy needed to return to Rome. Remember that vision she had when she was 6 years old of Christ in pontifical robes. She wrote to the Pope at the time, who was Gregory XI, and said, "Dear Gregory," or rather dictated, "Dear Gregory, I had a vision when I was 6. You need to come back to Rome." She was invited for an audience with the Pope. Now just imagine Pope Francis calling you up right now and saying, "Come visit me, let's talk." A big deal for anybody, but especially a 14th century Sienese woman. Catherine makes her way up to Avignon with her entourage, of course, and manages to convince Gregory to come back to Rome. In 1376, the Pope makes his triumphant return. Unfortunately, 2 years later, in 1378, Gregory XI died and there was a new conclave. The conclave is the election of the Pope. It should be noted that Gregory XI, like the previous popes in Avignon, was French. During the conclave, an Italian pope was elected, Urban VI. Now, I don't want to give away too much of my tours, but what happens when Urban VI is elected? Well, you have to remember that Rome was not the Rome you think of today. It was a very dangerous city. St. Peter's was not the huge basilica you think of now, but a bit more dinky and definitely more unsafe in a very swampy area on the other side of the Tiber, where it still is today, but they've cleaned things up a bit. I like to imagine all of the French cardinals looking around and saying, "Nous sommes nus. We had this magnificent Palais des Papes in Avignon. This place is terrible. Allez, mes amis, on va tourner à l'Avignon." I do believe that is an accurate historical interpretation of the events that transpired. The cardinals, they make their way back to Avignon, and what happens? They elect their own pope, the anti-pope Clement VII. In 1378, therefore, we have a pope claiming legitimacy in Rome and a pope claiming legitimacy in Avignon. We call this the Great Schism of the West. It lasted from 1378 until 1417. Not a great time for the papacy. And Catherine, well, not saying that she was totally blamed for this, but she may have had an integral role, which didn't really help her popularity. Catherine was heartbroken when the schism happened in 1378, and just 2 years later, she died at the age of 33, just like Jesus Christ. Without going too much into it, did Catherine die at 33 from a broken heart? Or was it more related to the fact that she abused her body? She would flagellate herself for the sins of the world. She would limit her food intake so that for weeks she would survive on just the Eucharist alone. She is what some scholars have called a holy anorexic. But again, that's a different story. The point is, Catherine died in 1380 in Rome, just around the corner from the Pantheon, and then her body was taken to the Dominican church of Santa Maria sopra Minerva, where it was on display, and people came and miracles occurred. A miracle during one's life, or posthumously after their life, is a sure sign of sainthood. A few people were cured of their ailments by touching her body in Santa Maria sopra Minerva. She was then laid to rest in the chapel just to the right of the high altar, and now, should you go to Rome, you can go and say hello to her, as her body is under the high altar. Well, most of her body. She dies in 1380. In 1383, her head is processed up to Siena, and so if you'd like to see her head, and also her thumb, all you need to do is go to San Domenico. Her foot, on the other hand, her foot was also removed and taken up to Venice, where Thomas Caffarini was trying to promote her cult and work on her canonization. Should you find yourself in the church of Santi Giovanni e Paolo, or Zanipolo, you can see Catherine's foot. Very small. Her arm is somewhere out there along with these 4 fingers, but as I mentioned, her thumb is in Siena. This does seem a bit morbid for those of you who aren't Catholic. Why are there body parts of saints all over the place? I should do an episode on relics. Yes, you should. I shall do. Now, with all of these miracles and all of these amazing things that Catherine did during her life, you might think, well, Santa subito, right? She would have been canonized immediately. That's not what happened. It took 81 years for Catherine to become a saint. I suppose in the scheme of things, it's not that bad, considering Saint Bernardo Tolomei, who died in 1348, was only canonized in 2009. It took a pope from Siena to finally canonize her. Pope Pius II made her a saint in 1461. Canonizations, they're always kind of political, but Catherine proved to be a very popular saint indeed. Catherine is not one of the patron saints of Siena, as I mentioned before, but she is patron saint of the Drago and the Oca. But she is patron saint of Rome, declared as such in 1866. And she was declared co-patron saint of Italy with Saint Francis of Assisi. So the 2 patron saints of Italy are Stigmatics. They received the wounds of Christ on the cross. One founded the Franciscan order, Saint Francis, and Catherine was a Dominican. And of course you have 1 man and 1 woman. Not only that, Catherine was also declared the first female doctor of the church in 1970, together with Teresa of Avila. And who is a doctor of the church? That is someone who has, through their study, through their writings, contributed to the understanding of theology. Catherine's contribution to theology comes through her understanding of scripture and of the Psalms in particular. And she had this wonderful way of rewriting them in her letters to try and get her point across. Because you must remember that Catherine was Sienese. The Sienese are very strong-willed, and I think that that's one of the reasons we're so proud of her here. She managed to convince warring families to stop fighting. She even went to Florence to try and bring peace between Florence and the papacy. And of course, she brought the papacy back from Avignon to Rome. She also wrote a book, again dictated, but we'll just say wrote, The Dialogue of Divine Providence, and it's basically a conversation between the soul and God. This is why you'll often see her holding a book. Saints who are shown holding books might be the four evangelists, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, or founders of orders like Saint Dominic, or that great theologian and doctor of the church, Thomas Aquinas. The Dominican order is known as a scholarly order, and while Catherine was no scholar, she was fiercely intelligent. And because of her work in the hospital, she is known as a patron saint of nurses. And one more feather in Catherine's cap, as it were. In 1999, Pope John Paul II added Catherine as one of the patron saints of Europe. Catherine's greatest wish in this life was to unify the church, to bring together warring families and cities, and ensure that everyone lived in harmony. I know, world peace for all, but she really did believe in it, and so that's why John Paul II made her a patron saint of Europe. I wonder what Catherine would have to say about Brexit. I don't think she'd be happy about it at all. I agree. I could go on and on and on about Catherine, but I do want to make sure that you can recognize her should you find yourselves in an Italian church or an art gallery. She wears the black and white robes of the Dominican order. She will often hold a crucifix that represents her stigmata and also her devotion to Christ. She may or may not be wearing the crown of thorns. She may have some of her letters or perhaps a book under her arm. You may see her in an ecstatic vision, or as just a part of a holy conversation, or perhaps with the Madonna and Child. I do hope that you enjoyed learning about Catherine because, as I say, she's kind of a big deal, not just for me personally, but for the history of the church and Europe, really. Her works are really interesting to read. The way that she manipulates the language is really quite wonderful. And of course, there are some very inspirational things here and there. My absolute favorite quote by Catherine of Siena comes from one of her letters, letter 368 to be precise. She writes to one of her followers in support of Urban VI, the newly elected pope. However, this line, I think, can apply to all of us, not just popes and schisms and things like that. Shall I read the Italian? Se sarete quello che dovete essere, metterete fuoco in tutta Italia. It's so good. Loosely translated, what does it mean? She says, when you become that which you are meant to be, you will set the world ablaze. It's powerful stuff. Isn't that magnificent? All of this from a 14th century Sienese woman. I don't care what your faith is, that stuff is meaningful. Why is Catherine so important to me? She changed the course of my life. By studying Saint Catherine of Siena, I was able to become a professor, and now I live in Italy, my dream. And not only do I live in Italy, I live in her hometown. And I must say, thank you, Catherine, for helping me become the person that I was meant to be. Sorry, I get a bit emotional thinking about that, but I believe it. Thank you for joining us on this very special edition of A Guide to Recognizing Your Saints, and I hope to see you again soon for another episode. Ciao!